in these tough times, we're really keen to work with you to optimize your spend and help you spend less on AWS. Hopefully we all get out of this stronger and tougher, and today we'll be talking about a few different areas where you can save. And so in terms of content, I'll be covering the overview of different ways you can optimize cost on AWS, both commercial, where finance teams may be involved, and technical, where many of the engineering teams will be involved. In terms of the savings areas, for the most impactful ones, I've highlighted and broken them down. So talking about how to find oversized resources, which tools to use and how to go about it, the best way to turn off resources outside of work hours, when it makes sense to get savings plans, which is a discount in exchange for commitment. But during these times where your future workload may be a bit more uncertain and more dynamic, some thinking and considerations of how much should you go for is shared. We'll talk about a few other different ways to run more efficiently as well, and also share with you many recently updated things from our AWS platform itself that can help in costs and also cost management. At the end, we'll close out with a Q&A, and then when the webinar ends, there'll be a survey as well. And so a tiny bit of housekeeping, you can ask any questions you have during the webinar and at the end as well in the question and answer box to the right. And so before we quite begin, let's talk about how far optimization can take your company. And so having worked with many customers, the range of IT cost versus total company revenue, it's quite a broad range, and typically it falls somewhere between 4 to 12%. However, the best I've seen for a customer who was all in on the cloud and using a lot of advanced architectures and serverless methods, they managed to drive it down all the way down to 1% for the entire IT infrastructure fleet. And the implication for them from a startup perspective and generally from an enterprise customer perspective as well, they have a longer runway to operate. They have higher sustainability and profitability. They have better free cash flow and overall valuation of the company as well. And all the while maintaining their business agility as well, being able to meet customer needs fast. And it doesn't mean they operated in a way where they were super, frugal and locked down spends, but more people felt responsible for the spends. On the other side, I've seen organizations who operate their IT infrastructure at about 40% of total company revenue, which is very high. And just to give you an illustration of how far and the different range of costs, and you can compare that to your own business and have a bit of a benchmark and an idea. Of course, each type of industry and business is a little bit different, so it wouldn't feel bad if you're sort of somewhere in the middle of the pack, but optimization can drive a lot of savings as well. And so if we go into the levers of optimization, not all optimizations are made the same, and you shouldn't do them all at the same time. In fact, there may be some you should defer to later or even not do at all. And so in thinking about this space, I've laid out different ways to optimize in terms of complexity. So things that are a bit harder to do and require more effort or knowledge, laid out to the right, and then things on the left will be a bit more simpler and faster to execute. However, some of the things that are simpler and faster to execute may not have much impact, but there are others that have a lot of impact and can save a lot of dollars and percentage. And so highlighting some of those, and for the non-technical people in the audience, I'll try to articulate at a bit of a high level in terms of what these things means. But for a technical audience, I'll jump in and out of depth as well. So hopefully covering for everyone. And so first of all, at the bottom left, we have S3 intelligent tiering. It takes a matter of a few, maybe 10 minutes to turn on. And what it does is for your storage, object storage that is on S3, there's a service that uses AI ML and automatically figures out for you, hey, should this be in regular S3, which costs more, or should this be in infrequent access, which costs less? And it will observe on your behalf how often are you accessing those objects and move them around for you. And so in a matter of minutes, you can trim your S3 costs. For one customer, I saw turning this on saved about 25% of their S3 costs. So depending on how many hundreds of dollars or maybe thousands of dollars you're spending on S3, it could be a really quick win to get in not too long of a time. There are also many ways to delete idle resources. I'll be sharing a few. You can also resize prior to moving on to AWS. So cloud, there shouldn't be any commercial reason, especially in the long term, why it's more expensive, especially when following these principles. And one of the ways to save is making sure your resources are fit to what they need to be, sized as, before you move things on the cloud. Other simpler and more impactful things to do are things like savings plans, which is a discount in exchange for commitment, and enterprise programs as well, which is a broad brush way to discount your usage with commitment as well. And so in terms of the commercial pieces, really the top left, savings plans and enterprise programs are the commercial pieces, whereas other things are a bit more technical. And so I encourage you to start here first if you haven't done these things. And if you have done these things, we can move on to a few other activities as well. So also super impactful is scheduling, so turning off your resources at night, and I'll share more about that shortly. And also reserved instances or RIs. Again, there are savings in exchange for discounts and impactful because it applies to a lot of your spend. If you're to right-size resources that are already running at the moment, I would argue that during these times, maybe it's more impactful than normal because of variation in customer demand, but it can be a bit trickier, and I'll talk you through the considerations around that, doing it in your environment, and demo some tools as well. And then finally, you can apply more advanced cloud-based methods like using Spot, using serverless, auto-scaling, and other cost-aware architecture. So this is more of an engineering focus, but they are extremely impactful. And I've seen customers where they've switched from using regular servers into serverless and saved to the tune of 90 to 95%. But they're usually longer term projects and require upfront design investment or re-architecture if you're doing it reactively. Just mentioning here as well, Spot is a bit of a special case where sometimes re-architecture isn't needed, and it's actually quite straightforward to do. And in the ASEAN country, we do have Spot specialists to help our customers as well if you do need the support. And usually our solution architects can also help you out too if you contact the account team. And so hopefully this gives you a bit of an idea of where to start. Generally on the left as much as possible towards the top left. And if you find out from your solution architects or work with AWS, there may be bits and pieces where you're able to take advantage of things like Spot and auto-scaling to get results as well. Now, all of this activity is nice to know, but it's underpinned by a few things, two things primarily. The first one is there needs to be cost awareness and visibility. So a question to ask your teams is, hey, do you guys know how much your spending was last month? And if the answer is no, then it's likely that they would benefit from having access to tools such as Cost Explorer, which I'll show shortly, and providing them with that information so that they know what they're spending, how it's changing over time, and what they're responsible for. The second piece is organizational behavioral mechanisms. I'll expand on this shortly, but essentially there are some ingredients to make this all work with regards to getting people to take action as well. It's nice knowing about these things. It's also nice having the tools, but sometimes you need more than that to get results in terms of actual savings. Jeff Bezos quoted once saying that good intentions are nice, but mechanisms are what you actually need to get results. And so in terms of mechanisms, there needs to be, and this mental model and framework of motivation, ability, and prompts comes from a Stanford social scientist called BJ Fogg. And essentially it talks about when activity happens and when behavior happens versus when it doesn't. And so if there's enough motivation and there's enough ability, when people are prompted to do something, then the activity happens. And so making that a bit more real, from a motivation perspective, that includes things like having strong executive support to drive optimization activity and consistent communications, letting people know that this is important, and tracking how it's doing. External cost pressures, especially in today's environment, that might be something quite relevant, driving your motivation to A, attend this webinar, and B, optimize on AWS. But there are things that can detract from the motivations. So if engineers feel like they need to prioritize performance, uptime, and features, or they're quite scared to optimize because, hey, we don't know what it'll do to our application performance, then that can reduce the amount of motivation that's available to execute. In terms of ability, what will improve your ability especially for bigger companies, less so for smaller companies because you sit in the same room and it's easy to discuss with each other what needs to be done. But for larger companies, you may need a single-threaded authority to drive optimization results, either at a central level and quite often within each team that has a lot of the spend. Training and tools helps. So from a training perspective, you can share this webinar with your colleagues afterwards to give a bit more insight and info on where to focus. Time should be given to engineers to optimize spend. And so if project timelines are super tight and nothing changes there, then they might decide to continue to launch features and products without dedicating or being allowed to have enough time to optimize. And finally, I've worked with some customers where there are organizational policies that slow action. For example, one company had a rule where development and testing resources had to be the same as their customer-facing production resources. And with that rule, they weren't able to or didn't want to make their development resources smaller. And so there were really big oversized development resources that cost a lot of money, but engineers didn't want to break the rule about keeping them the same. And so have a look at what's blocking you from that perspective as well. And then finally, I found the most impactful and really easy to use ways to prompt is to use cost dashboards shared with individuals. And ideally, the costs represent what those individuals are responsible for or those teams. And some sort of cadence to review those cost dashboards or review general spends, whether it be daily or weekly. Much better that it's daily and weekly rather than monthly, because usually at a monthly level, unexpected spend could happen at the start of the month, and you don't really find out until halfway through the next month, which is quite late, and you've already spent some spend that you didn't intend to. So if you see that despite the pressures, despite the messaging that things aren't working and spend keeps going up, have a think about this framework and see what's missing with regards to the motivation, ability, or prompting. So as I mentioned, from a prompt perspective and also just from an ability to execute perspective, super important to use a cost visibility tool. And for many of our newer customers, they start with the monthly AWS invoice, which is the normal way or the traditional way to manage IT infrastructure costs. You get an invoice and you pay it off and off you go. And typically engineering teams never had the much need to optimize costs ongoing because it's paid upfront, negotiated by procurement, and you just worry about security, performance, and other things. But on cloud, that changes a bit, and because it's quite much more dynamic. And the more dynamic it is, the more you want to use some more advanced tools. So I recommend starting with number 3, which is Cost Explorer and AWS Budgets, which gives you visibility and notifications as well. And so let me give you a quick demonstration of Cost Explorer and see what that looks like. So to access Cost Explorer, you'll need to be given permission if you don't have it already. And essentially you find it by searching services, Cost Explorer. And it's the first one there when you type that. And when I click on this, it'll bring me to my own Cost Explorer, which I was just at. And one of the best ways to dig in is just simply to click Explore Costs here. And so at first, when you come in, this chart isn't that meaningful. I don't see what's quite going on. And so you can click on Reports and just find monthly costs by service. So this is becoming a bit of a clearer picture. And if I trim down to 3 months, I can see exactly which services I'm using. And for my environment in March, I've used mostly EC2 instances, some Redshift, some RDS, and some EC2 Other, and QuickSight as well. So from a top 5 perspective, these are my top 5. And when it comes to actually driving optimization, this is one of the most important things to start with. By team, find out what are your top 5 services, because you might hear a tip about optimization and you go, okay, that sounds like a great idea. Let me go optimize. But it could be acting against, something in this green bar or something against EC2 other. And despite all of my efforts in engineering work, the maximum possible impact, at least in my environment, it can have for EC2 other is, $26 a month, which isn't much. And so try to focus first on the top spends and then learn about, hey, how do I optimize each of these spends one by one? There's lots of slicing and dicing you can do here, as well as filtering by service, filtering by account, and so forth. And you can also filter by tags as well. So also mention budgets, and let me just briefly mention what budgets does. You can find it in the cost management console and go to the budgets on the left. So I've already made one budget, but let me create a fresh one. And so you might be setting up a cost budget and say, for example, I want it to be roughly the same as what I spent last month. So I might say monthly budget number 2, monthly budget 2. Keep the period as monthly, keep it recurring, and I'll turn it into a monthly budget rather than a fixed value. And in here, it's already telling me that I've spent $1,038 last month, and I'm going to click autofill budgeted amounts. And what this lets me do is fill it out for the next 12 months based on a starting value. So I'll say I don't want to spend more than 1,100 per month, and budget growth, expecting a small amount of growth perhaps at 1% per month. And autofill, that will completely fill out the next 12 months of budget, and by March next year, it will be at 1227. Down below, you can even filter for specific services or specific accounts and start setting budgets at an account level. But for myself, I'm just setting it on my overall account. Configuring alerts. So I can alert based on whether the spend has hit an actual amount or if the spend has hit a forecast amount. And for me, what I'll try to do here is say, if the forecast amount is about to hit 100% of budget, give me an email notification. And so that'll just send an email to me if it's forecast to hit 100. Maybe I'll even set it at 110. That's when I really care. And perhaps even set some actual ones at, say, 50%. So if you set an actual at 50%, you might expect roughly halfway through the month, you should get an alert. And if you get it maybe one day into the month or a few days into the month, you know something's going on. So confirming that, creating that, pretty much as straightforward as that, and it'll start alerting you based on what you've set up. So that was a quick rundown of Cost Explorer and budgets. Feel free to play around with it. There are lots of options you can try, but essentially one is for insights and one is for notifications. So for customers who haven't tried to resize resources before, and even if you have, quite often it's quite easy to have resources that work and perform, but could be oversized for what you actually need. From a resource perspective, AWS provides many different types, so different families, different sizes, and there are tools to help you pick the right ones. So if you were already running something and you wanted to resize it, this is the type of process you might go through. So first of all, just using an example, say you're running an M4 Forex Large instance, which is an EC2 computing machine, and perhaps it's costing $1.72 per hour. There are tools available you can check to see, okay, can I right size or resize this thing to make it smaller? And the tool will observe things like CPU utilization, memory utilization, and suggest a new instance as well. You might have to confirm with your engineering teams that there aren't any other blockers to resizing. So for example, either that the instance may be for disaster recovery purposes and we don't expect it to have high utilization until we need to, fail over to a different region. There might be other reasons such as, hey, this resource is already committed to, and if we resize it now, it will have no impact because we've got a discount through commitment. Let's do it in a few months' time. So check with your teams about that. The third one is confirming that the resource is actually running on on-demand spend and not heavily reserved or on committed spend. Because if you resize something that's already on committed spend, you pay for that committed spend anyways, if that committed spend can't be used elsewhere, and then you pay for this resource as well, albeit a smaller version of it. And so I'll show you how to confirm that. After you resize, you might be saving quite a bit. So in this case, we resize twice. So from 4x large to large, sorry, that might be 8 times. And review that your performance is still working okay. And then in this case, you save 87%. I've seen one customer do this for their non-production RDS instances, moving from the bigger M or R instances down to smaller T instances. Outside of production or outside of customer-facing resources for your internal teams, it might be okay to get away with those smaller ones and pay a lot less. So on the AWS platform, there are 3 tools available for resource sizing. AWS Compute Optimizer, a bit newer. There's AWS Cost Explorer Resource Optimizer, and finally, AWS Trusted Advisor. Now, you might be asking, hey, there's 3, which one should I use? Let's go on to the next page. So highlighted in green are the places or the tools where the tool has a bit of an advantage over the others. And so you can see on the screen that Compute Optimizer has the most green/bold bits of text. And apologies, the green is quite close color to the black, but this Compute Optimizer does have the most benefits. The only detractor or the only advantage that some of the other tools have is, for example, in Cost Explorer, it's actually considerate of your existing commitments and reservations. So it will say, yes, you can resize it, but actually you'll save $0 because this one's already on a commitment, where Compute Optimizer doesn't see that, and it can suggest savings even if it's on a commitment. And so I encourage you to use those 2 tools in combination to know which ones to resize. So if your Compute Optimizer says, hey, there's a lot of savings, EC2 Cost Explorer says there's no savings to be had, then it's quite likely on a reservation or commitment. You can see that Trusted Advisor can also suggest things, but it hasn't got any advantages over the other 2, and I'd recommend you use the other 2 for resizing. Trusted Advisor has a lot of other checks beyond resizing, so you can still use it for that. A few caveats. It might be difficult to resize older apps because they might not run in the new architecture, so consider that before you do the resizing. As mentioned, some resources are meant to be oversized, so you can take them off the list. And finally, there are some resizing technical considerations as well. So especially going from the older instance types to the newer ones, there are some actions to be taken. And so a quick demo of the tool of Compute Optimizer and what that looks like. So if you search AWS Compute Optimizer, it'll come up as the relevant tool and bring you over to this screen. And what this is telling me is in my particular region, I'm looking at Sydney at the moment, there are some optimized resources, about 5, and 5 over-provisioned resources as well. So great, I'm not going to look at the optimized ones. Let's look at over-provisioned. And you can see auto-scaling is also over here. So in terms of these resources, it's saying that, okay, currently I'm running these types, and it's suggesting I can turn it into these types. So from T2 medium to T3 micro, from M4 X large to an R5 large. And so you can see in here, it even suggests a different family change as well. And this resource is running at 25 cents per hour, whereas the R5 large will be 15 cents per hour, saving me effectively about 10 cents per hour. Now, although yes, this one's not too big, in environments where maybe you've been testing very large, say, machine learning type of machines, during the downtimes, perhaps this savings will be much, much bigger. And it'll also be quite a bit bigger, especially if you run many different workloads. And so in terms of the step about checking whether it's on a commitment or not, one thing you can do is use this instance ID and look up the machine within Cost Explorer. So I'll just show you how that's done. So in Cost Explorer, if you turn on hourly costs, click OK. The hourly costs has a small fee, quite small. You can check the pricing pages of how much it is, but very, very small percentage of the actual instance cost. And it will reveal to you how much it's spending per hour. And I'll just flick it over to 1 day for now. And I copied and pasted that resource earlier. I'm going to search for that. There we go. There's my resource. So you can see that this resource is costing about 25 cents per hour. And if I go to more and click purchase option, I can confirm that it's actually running on demand and not on some sort of commitment. And so through that, I'm more comfortable to know that if I do resize it, I will be actually paying less. I won't show you the exact demo of stopping the resource and changing its size and starting it up again. But from a console perspective, it's really straightforward to do. If you're launching your resources through automated code, such as Terraform or CloudFormation, you'll probably need to change it there. But otherwise, yeah, an in-console edit works as well. So we've talked about resizing. Let's talk about turning things off outside of work hours. Sounds pretty straightforward. I think it is pretty straightforward, but there are some tips and tricks around that too. And so this is some real customer data where they've turned off their resources outside of work hours and said, hey, anyone who's got non-production resources, as much as possible, please put a tag on the resource saying this should turn off at night and automatically turn on in the morning. So you can see that in terms of this chart, about half of it is white, half of it is pink, and the pink is spend, the white is effectively saved spend. If they didn't have this policy, you'd probably expect that whole block to be pink. So they're saving maybe about 50%. So one day this customer decided, hey, why don't we implement a policy that just turns off non-production resources at night and we don't automatically turn it on in the morning. And it's a default thing. So people can opt out and say, hey, my resource cannot turn off at night. Perhaps it's a SAP workload that holds a lot of in-memory content and it's not okay to turn it off, even in non-production. Sure, opt out, that's okay. But for everything else, the default is turn off. And what happened for this customer was about half of that consistent usage disappeared. And it turns out that those resources, people had moved on to different projects. It was simply untagged and people didn't know who owned it. And so implementing more holistic automated policies can drive even further savings than opting things in. So this works for EC2 non-production or resources that don't face the customer, and for RDS as well. And this also works for Redshift now, as of a few weeks ago. And so give it a shot because it's one of the most impactful things you can do, especially if your non-production workload is large. Another quick story is I've seen this again at a different customer, and they had a time period where for many weeks they couldn't get the teams to find enough time to do optimization. And then they said, okay, let's just have a lot of conversations and get this automated policy going to just automatically switch things off unless people opt out. Within the space of the week, completely cleaned up. Whereas for many, many months prior to that, sending the emails of reports of things to do, it didn't quite work. And so I strongly encourage this type of agreement and policy. So in terms of tooling, you can use Cost Explorer to find resources and specific instance IDs and owners that look like they're non-production and could be turned off. And also you can use AWS Instance Scheduler in combination with EC2 and RDS to actually do the automation to turn things off. Instance Scheduler hasn't yet been updated since the Redshift thing happened very recently to schedule Redshift for you. So you might need to do a little bit more custom scripting there. So Instance Scheduler demo, let's have a look. So Instance Scheduler is a tool provided by AWS free of charge. The code itself is free, but it does spin up a few resources that cost a small amount. Should be in the range of a few dollars to maybe a few tens of dollars at maximum, but uses serverless tools and services, which should be super cheap. It will almost certainly save you way more than in turning off resources than it costs you to run this. And so what it's created with is essentially CloudFormation, which is the cloud's infrastructure as code. So AWS teams have scripted this up as code, and essentially you can deploy this within about the space of 5 minutes. I was a bit slower, took about 15 minutes, but essentially in deploying this, you can start tagging your resources, and the resources that are tagged appropriately will start automatically switching on and off based on what you configure. So after you deploy this, what will spin up is a thing that looks like this within CloudFormation. And so I've just named the Instance Scheduler, and what it creates, or one thing that it creates, is a particular DynamoDB table. DynamoDB is AWS's NoSQL database service, and essentially in this DynamoDB table, it holds your various schedules that A, pre-populated, so you can use some out-of-the-box ones, or B, you can also configure your own. And so just talking you through this table and how you might be using it, let's go down and have a look at a particular schedule. So the schedule I'm currently using for my testing instances are AU office hours. And essentially it's, the office hours in Australia. So how does it work? So it has one value here called period, which is office hours, right? It has a time zone of Australia/Sydney, and it has nothing else. Okay, so let's have a quick look at what periods office hours is saying. So period office hours is over here, and it's saying that in the weekdays column, it's Monday to Friday, okay, just defining which days. And you can also see here, you can set things to be Saturday, Sunday as well. You can set it just to be Monday. And so there's a bit of flexibility around what you actually consider to be office hours. There's a begin time and an end time as well. So it begins at 8 a.m. and it ends at 6 p.m. And you can see for my other schedule, I've got one where it doesn't have a begin time. And so that's how you apply the mandatory opt-out automatic turn-off policy. So for this one, it says office hours off only. So it just turns resources off without turning them on. And people can manually turn them on in the mornings. And so this one is flagged as Monday to Friday and turns off at night. On the, here we go. On the instances themselves, the two instances I've picked to do the scheduling are these two. So scheduling not optimized and scheduling optimized. And just comparing the tags, let's have a quick look. So for scheduling optimized, what I have in the tags are a key called schedule, and you can actually configure that within the instance scheduler to decide what that key is actually called. And the value is AU office hours. So the expectation is this resource starts switching on and off based on AU office hours. The second one is scheduling not optimized. And that one is essentially operated on a schedule, but it has NA as the value. If your instance switches off and people still need to work, you can always manually switch it on again manually by yourself. At the same time, there are third-party tools that help it be a bit more friendly. For example, send notifications to Slack before it actually turns off. So essentially, I've filtered for my two resources where the two I've picked are the ones I've just shown earlier with the two different tags. They're both the same resource, an M4 large resource. And essentially, you can see that one is costing $3 per day with the darker blue line, and one is much cheaper at about $1 per day and free on weekends. And if you turn this into a monthly chart, essentially you can see the drastic difference between the two resources. Effectively the same business outcome, but one is about 70% cheaper than the other. So definitely have a go if you do have non-prod resources that could be turned off. A few tips. So we've already talked about this. A default off policy can be very helpful. If your instances are in an auto-scaling group, they might set themselves to the minimum group size. And quite often the default is a value of 1. And so even if you manually turn these instances off, the auto-scaling group will sort of fix itself and put it back to 1. So if you have non-prod auto-scaling groups, you can set those minimum size down to 0 if you're doing this activity. And if you're operating out of Singapore or some other country, then have a look at the different time zone names. So you can see that in my one, I had Australia, Sydney, but the official time zone names to put into DynamoDB are listed over there. So recently we came out with savings plans, and this one was at the far top left, so really impactful and easy to do. Effectively, I'll just talk about what it is and also the thinking around it, especially during these times. Should you still go for discount for commitment? And so hopefully have heard about reserved instances before. Effectively, they were commitment in exchange for savings, but there was a little bit of work to do around planning and management because you needed to match the instance family, size, operating system, region, and tenancy. And if it ever mismatched, then you might be paying for both the reserved instance and your running instance, which was why I was checking carefully in Cost Explorer earlier when I did the resource resizing. Part of this problem starts going away with savings plans. So savings plans, you can see that commercially, it's about the same, if not exactly the same as reserved instances, except for SUSE operating system, where RIs or reserved instances is still a bit better. But you can see the matching criteria is going away. And so it doesn't care about size, operating system, or AZ or tenancy. It only cares about family or region. And so the commitment, instead of to all those things, you're really just committing to a certain dollars per hour in a region. For example, $5 per hour of C5 in Sydney. Compute savings plans is even more flexible. It comes with a little bit less discount versus the other option for savings plans. But this one's super flexible. So really it's a dollar commitment against AWS compute globally. So for example, $10 per hour on AWS compute. Doesn't matter if you change size, doesn't matter if you change operating system, as long as you maintain a minimum threshold of spend, this will give you the discount. And so super flexible and highly recommended to go for savings plans as opposed to reserved instances for EC2 and Fargate and Lambda as well. We quite often hear from customers how the recommendations are calculated. And so this chart will give you a bit of an idea. And so this is a view where in Cost Explorer, I filtered for EC2 running hours, amortized the cost as well, so I can see the smooth outspend of any reserved instances, and group by purchase option. And so you can see this in this chart, the darker blue purple lines are on demand, and the minimum level of on demand per day that this customer is using is about $2,000. It's grown a bit in recent times, up to about $3,000. And so when you think about how the recommendation tool makes its recommendation, it looks at this essentially. And what it does is it keeps increasing that orange line until the point where making that commitment will not save you money. And so the commitment value is the post discount value. And so if you're running about $2,000 per day on demand, then the equivalent discounted version is about 1.5 thousand under a 25% discount, and that equates to $62.5 per hour. And so effectively, the recommendation engine is looking at this in your environment. If you want to build your confidence about, hey, where's this actually coming from? Have I been using resources like this over a really long time? You can actually stretch out the time window to a much longer time horizon to check. So for example, you can check your entire past year of history of on-demand use and confirm that you're likely to be able to use this. So forecasting is always a bit tricky. And so figuring out the right level of commitment, you should have a think about these areas. One is, what is driving any increase in workload or demand? Am I migrating more workloads to the cloud? Am I merging in new accounts? Are there projects that are landing and finishing and we're doing more? Or is there just a general increase in demand? On the other side, things that can decrease demand are things like general reducing demand, moving to spot, clean up resources, turning off non-production resources, and things like moving to serverless. Usually, with regards to moving things to serverless, it's a much longer time period, as with Spot, a bit more of a longer time horizon. And so you can plan for that in a bit into the future. And so what I've seen many customers do is, given the total recommendation, they either take some off or pick a certain percentage of it. And one good practice to use is you pick a small percentage of that total recommendation, say for example 10 to 20%. You commit to it, you use it, you check that it's working properly, and observe its savings within Cost Explorer. And once you're happy that it's actually saving you money, you can do it again next month. And so month by month, you can ramp up to the level you're comfortable with. And so in this example, I'm illustrating a case where if you're expecting about 50% reduction in on-demand spend over the course of the next year, then you can commit to something to the tune of 50% of the savings plan recommendation. And so at least right from the start, you'll be saving about anywhere between 15 to 40% off with a one-year commitment, but you plan in advance for the expected drop through optimizations and other activities you're doing. So a quick demo of what purchasing savings plans looks like. So to purchase savings plans, you go to your Cost Explorer and go to recommendations to have a look at how much it actually recommends. My one, there aren't any recommendations yet, but also recently released linked account level recommendations. And so on the purchase savings plan screen, you can pick your type of savings plans. The more flexible one is compute. Pick your term, 1 year or 3 years. And the minimum hourly commit is 0.001. And so that's what I'm going to use in my account. And I'll say I want the partial upfront version. So that's all set. It's saying I pay $5 up front and I pay the rest in monthly charges. Add to cart, review the order that it's all okay, and submit the order. And once you've submitted it, it will appear in your savings plan inventory. So this is all your savings plans that you've got. And in terms of monitoring if it's working or not, you can go to utilization report, and the utilization report will tell you exactly how much each of your savings plans has been saving in the past. I've been using really tiny numbers, so some of them are 0, but you can see that others saving for me $3 over time. And the number should be much bigger for you, especially if you don't use, a few cents of commit. Keep in mind that RIs are still available for non-EC2 services, such as RDS, Redshift, Elasticsearch, and there are also commitments for Dynamo, DB, and CloudFront as well. Wrapping up and getting close to question time, I'll briefly go through this, but essentially there are many, many other ways you can save as well. So you can decommission unused resources, such as any of these services. Elastic IPs might be unattached, EBS might be unattached as well. The ones that are bigger cost are usually EBS, maybe unattached load balancers, and generally idle instances. Sometimes snapshot policies are a bit too aggressive, so too frequent, or keeping them for too long. You can clean that up and potentially save a good amount there. And so one of the tools available, and it becomes available with business support or above, is Trusted Advisor. And Trusted Advisor essentially checks, makes about 11 different checks on your environment of areas where you might be able to save. I won't go into detail here, but I'll just mention two things to just ignore and skip. The first thing is this low utilization EC2 instances. Use the Compute Optimizer or the Cost Explorer Optimizer for that because they're more modern, recent, and a bit better. And the second one is EC2 Reserved Instances Optimization. You don't really need that one here anymore either because the one in Cost Explorer, again, is a bit more modern and more configurable as well. But all the other checks you can make use of and take advantage of for savings. And then, yes, there are things you can do to clean up, but also from a re-architecture perspective, there's really high potential in many of these. And so one of them I mentioned was Amazon EC2 Spot. And Spot is really a match made in heaven for things like containers, web applications, EMR, the CI part of CI/CD pipelines. And so have a think about Spot for some of those applications where the changes could be very, very minimal to your code. There's also a bit of a trick. So certain regions have pretty specific and cheap pricing for certain instances. And so one of the tips is in India, they have M5A instances, R5A, and C5A, the AMD driven instances. And they're about 40% cheaper than the M family, sorry, the regular M5 instances that run on the Intel processors instead. And so if you're able to run your dev tests in a different region and you're okay with the latency, then you might be able to take advantage of that particular instance family and type. So that overall summarizes the different ways to save. And again, two things to keep in mind when you're trying to find where to start. Try to go for the lower complexity things, and also focus on your highest spends. So use Cost Explorer to find your highest spends first and start from there. There have been a lot of product updates that will help with costs. So sharing some of those before we wrap up. Firstly, Workspaces in WorkDocs has up to 53 users for newer customers. So if you haven't used them before, there'll be 53 users for you up to until June 30. Savings plans we talked about. It also now applies to Lambda. Recommendations can come at linked account level, which is very new and recent. Compute Optimizer is quite new. Redshift Pause and Resume is super new. And we've had 2 recent price reductions as well. So for Cloud Endure, for disaster recovery or migrations as well, 80% price reduction there and a 50% price reduction for EKS. From a cost management product perspective, we've released cost categories, which can group your costs together and deal with some of the misspelled tags. There's hourly data available in Cost Explorer, which can show resource IDs. Tag policies can enforce tags across multiple AWS accounts. AWS budget reports can show you how your budgets have been doing in the past. Cost and usage report, if you use that in deep dive, then there's a data dictionary now. AWS budgets can integrate with Chatbot and Slack. And finally, if you're doing any training and certification at the moment, the exams are available online while many of us work from home. And so just to summarize everything, we've talked about the overview of different optimization levers, both technical and commercial, and keep in mind it's underpinned by A, visibility, and B, if things aren't progressing as fast as you expect, have a think about the motivations, abilities, and prompting. In terms of tools, we talked about Compute Optimizer and the differences between tools. We talked about how to turn off resources outside of work hours and how impactful a default off policy can be whilst keeping a opt-out option available. Talked about savings plans and some of the thinking around when should you go for more, when should you go for less, and ramping up slowly over time also works. We really quickly went through the different ways to optimize more efficiently. And finally, we shared recent product updates that might help with cost and cost management as well. So for the last bit, we'll open it up to a bit of Q&A with the remaining time. And for the survey, please do stick around for that because there's one important question that we ask you, which is, hey, do you want to have any follow-up following the session? And what we can do is give you a call and support you through the account team. But if you don't want follow-up, just type in no, and we'll try not to call you. But essentially, really appreciate your time today. And yeah, let's open it up to Q&A.